The message arrived at Earth Defense Command at 4 in the morning. Commander Jake Morrison was already awake, drinking his third cup of coffee when the communications officer rushed into his office. The young officer looked pale, his hands shaking as he handed over the datapad. Morrison took the device and watched as a holographic image flickered to life above its surface. An alien face appeared unlike anything he had seen before. The creature had 3 large eyes arranged in a triangle pattern on its head, and its skin shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between blue and purple. When it spoke, the translation software converted its words into English with a slight delay. The alien introduced herself as Ambassador Valkyra from the Galactic Council. Morrison had heard rumors about the Council, a group of advanced alien civilizations that controlled most of the known galaxy. For over 200 years, they had kept their distance from Earth, treating humanity like dangerous animals that should be watched but never approached. The official record said Earth was too dangerous, a hostile world where nothing should be able to survive, let alone build a civilization. Now this same council was asking for help. Valkyra explained the situation quickly. An enemy called the Zorthian Horde had been attacking council worlds for 3 months. They moved from system to system, destroying everything in their path. The council fleet had tried to stop them using every weapon they possessed, but nothing worked. The Horde ships had shields that adapted to any attack, and their soldiers were fierce warriors that overwhelmed the council's ground forces. The council had been forced back to their last defensive position in the Proxima system. If they lost this system, the Horde would have a clear path to the council's core worlds where billions of civilians lived. They were desperate, and desperation made them willing to break their long-standing policy about Earth. Morrison asked what kind of help they needed. The ambassador's response was simple. They needed soldiers. Their own troops were exhausted and demoralized. They needed reinforcements, fresh forces that could hold the line while they evacuated civilians and regrouped their fleet. The commander sat back in his chair, considering the request. This was a major decision, one that would need approval from the highest levels of Earth's government. But he also knew that politics moved slowly, and the council clearly didn't have time. He told the ambassador he would send what Earth could spare and ended the transmission. Within minutes, Morrison had contacted Admiral Lisa Morgan at Fleet Command. She listened to his summary of the situation without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. The admiral had been in the military for 30 years and had seen countless battles. She understood what this request really meant. The council thought they were asking for backup, for a few extra soldiers to help hold their defensive lines. They had no idea what they were actually getting. Earth's military had been preparing for this moment since the day they learned other intelligent life existed in the galaxy. Every training exercise, every weapons test, every tactical simulation had been designed with one goal in mind, making sure humanity could defend itself against threats from the stars. Admiral Morgan gave her approval. She authorized the immediate deployment of the UAD's Valkyrie, one of Earth's newest warships. The Valkyrie would carry a full company of Marines, 200 soldiers who represented the best that human military training could produce. Morrison would lead the mission personally. The next 12 hours were chaos. The Valkyrie's crew prepared the ship for immediate departure, while Marines from 3 different bases were rushed to the launch facility. Supply officers loaded weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and enough food to sustain the crew for 6 months. Engineers performed final checks on the ship's faster-than-light drive, the technology that would let them cross vast distances of space in days instead of centuries. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan supervised the loading of her squad's equipment in the main hangar bay. She watched as crates of rifles, grenades, and other weapons were secured in the cargo hold. These weren't the energy weapons that science fiction writers had imagined. Human military research had determined that old-fashioned kinetic weapons, guns that fired solid bullets at high speed, were more reliable and more effective than experimental energy systems. Each Marine carried a rifle that could fire armor-piercing rounds capable of punching through steel plates. They also carried sidearms, combat knives, grenades, and various other tools of war. Their armor was heavy, designed to protect against both projectile weapons and energy attacks. It made them look bulky and slow, but that was deceptive. Human soldiers had trained in this armor until wearing it felt as natural as wearing clothes. Sullivan's second-in-command, Sergeant Danny White, walked over carrying an equipment checklist. He had been in the Marines for 8 years and had seen action in several conflicts on Earth. This would be his first time fighting aliens, but he didn't seem nervous. If anything, he looked excited. The sergeant asked if Sullivan thought the aliens would be tougher than their training scenarios. She smiled and said they would find out soon enough. The truth was, nobody really knew what to expect. Earth's intelligence about the Zorthian horde was limited to what the Council had shared in their distress call. They knew the horde was aggressive and had powerful weapons, but that was about it. As the final preparations were completed, Captain Ryan Blake called the crew to their stations. The Valkyrie lifted off from Earth's surface, rising through the atmosphere on columns of superheated plasma from its main engines. Once clear of the atmosphere, the ship accelerated toward the edge of the solar system, where it was safe to engage the faster-than-light drive. Morrison stood on the bridge, watching Earth shrink behind them on the main view screen. He thought about what they were heading toward. The Council had called for help, expecting some kind of support that would buy them time. Instead, they were getting something they couldn't possibly understand. They were getting soldiers from a world where survival meant being tougher, meaner, and more adaptable than everything else on the planet. They were getting warriors descended from hunters who had spent millions of years learning how to kill efficiently. They were getting humans, and the galaxy had no idea what that really meant. The Valkyrie's faster-than-light drive engaged with a flash of distorted space. The ship vanished from Earth's solar system, beginning its journey toward the Proxima system and a war that would change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. Behind them, Earth continued its endless rotation, unaware that its children were about to show the universe what it meant to be born on a world where only the strongest survived. The Valkyrie dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Proxima system 5 days later. The transition from FTL to normal space was rough, causing the ship to shudder and groan as physics reasserted itself. On the bridge, Captain Ryan Blake checked the sensor readings while his crew recovered from the jump. What they saw on the screens was devastating. The system that had once been home to 3 billion Council citizens now looked like a graveyard. Orbital stations that had housed millions of workers drifted as twisted metal wreckage. Debris fields marked where ships had died in battle. The automated defense satellites that should have protected the system were nothing but clouds of shrapnel. In the center of the destruction, the Council fleet held position around the last habitable moon. Commander Morrison counted 47 Council ships ranging from small patrol craft to massive battleships. Even from this distance, he could see the damage they had taken. Scorch marks covered their hulls, and several ships showed signs of hull breaches that had been hastily patched. The communications officer established contact with the Council flagship. Ambassador Valkyra appeared on the main view screen, and Morrison could see the exhaustion on her face. Her 3 eyes were dim, and her skin had lost some of its color. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. When she saw the Valkyrie, confusion replaced relief on her face. She had expected a fleet, or at least a battle group with multiple ships. Earth had sent a single vessel that was barely half the size of the smallest Council destroyer. Morrison could see her trying to hide her disappointment as she welcomed him to the Proxima system. Before Morrison could respond, alarm sirens began wailing throughout both fleets. The tactical officer, Lieutenant Ben Parker, shouted that contact was coming through the asteroid belt. The Zorthian horde was beginning another attack run. Morrison ordered the crew to battle stations as he watched the enemy fleet emerge on the sensors. There were over 70 horde ships, each one looking more like a living creature than a machine. Their hulls pulsed with a sickly green light, and organic tendrils extended from their surfaces like the tentacles of deep-sea creatures. They moved through space in coordinated patterns that reminded Morrison of a school of sharks circling prey. The Council fleet moved into their defensive formation, a tactic they had obviously practiced many times during the past weeks of fighting. Their ships formed a wall between the horde and the moon, weapons charged and ready. Morrison noticed they were careful to maintain minimum safe distances from each other, avoiding any risk of friendly fire. Lieutenant Parker studied the data from previous battles that the Council had shared. He noticed something interesting in the patterns. The Council always fought defensively, trying to minimize casualties and protect their civilians. They used precision weapons that targeted specific systems on enemy ships, attempting to disable rather than destroy. It was a noble approach to warfare, but it was also slow and inefficient. The Horde, on the other hand, fought with pure aggression. They didn't care about their own losses. They threw ships at the Council lines until something broke through. Once inside the defensive perimeter, they caused chaos and forced the Council to break formation. It was brutal, wasteful, and highly effective against an enemy that valued every life. Parker shared his analysis with Morrison, who nodded slowly. The commander had seen similar situations during human conflicts. Throughout history, civilized armies had often struggled against enemies who were willing to accept terrible losses in pursuit of victory. The solution was usually to match that aggression while maintaining superior tactics and firepower. Morrison gave the order that would change everything. Instead of taking position in the Council's defensive line, the Valkyrie would attack. Captain Blake looked at him to confirm he had heard correctly. When Morrison repeated the order, Blake smiled and punched the commands into his console. The Valkyrie broke away from the Council fleet and accelerated directly toward the approaching Horde. On the Council flagship, Ambassador Valkyra watched in horror. She opened a channel to demand what the humans were doing, but Morrison had already closed communications. He needed total focus for what came next. The distance between the Valkyrie and the lead Horde ships closed rapidly. At 10,000 kilometers, the Horde opened fire with their energy weapons. Beams of concentrated plasma streaked across space, but the Valkyrie's pilot, Lieutenant Sam Carter, weaved between them with casual skill. She had logged over 1,000 hours in combat simulators and another 500 in real combat situations. Flying through enemy fire was just another day at work. At 5,000 kilometers, Lieutenant Commander Alex Turner brought the Valkyrie's weapons online. The ship carried systems that the Council had never seen before. Railguns lined the hull, electromagnetic weapons that could accelerate metal slugs to a significant fraction of light speed. Each slug contained enough kinetic energy to punch through several meters of armor plating. Turner opened fire at 3,000 kilometers, and the results were immediate. The railgun slugs tore through the Horde's adaptive shields as if they weren't there. The shields were designed to absorb and dissipate energy weapons, but they couldn't handle the raw kinetic impact of solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The first 3 Horde ships simply disintegrated as the slugs ripped through their hulls. The Horde tried to adapt, redirecting more power to their shields and adjusting their formation. But the Valkyrie wasn't finished. At 1,000 kilometers, Turner launched missiles. Not the guided torpedoes the Council used, but old-fashioned nuclear weapons. Each warhead contained enough explosive force to level a city. 12 missiles streaked toward the Horde formation. The Horde's point defense systems destroyed 9 of them, but 3 got through. The nuclear explosions were like miniature suns, blindingly bright even through the filtered view screens. When the light faded, 9 more Horde ships were gone, vaporized by the blasts. Another dozen ships were damaged, their hulls cracked and leaking atmosphere. Lieutenant Carter took the Valkyrie into the heart of the Horde formation, moving at speeds that would have terrified any Council pilot. She spun the ship through a complex series of maneuvers, each one calculated to keep them out of the enemies, firing solutions while positioning them for their own attacks. It looked reckless and suicidal to anyone watching, but every move had been practiced thousands of times. The Valkyrie's crew worked with mechanical precision. Turner fired the railguns in controlled bursts, each shot destroying or crippling a Horde vessel. The weapons officer didn't waste ammunition on damaged ships. He focused on targets that still posed a threat, maximizing the damage each shot inflicted on the enemy fleet. 10 minutes after the engagement began, the impossible happened. The Zorthian Horde, a force that had conquered 17 worlds through overwhelming aggression, began to retreat. Their ships broke formation and turned away from the battle, accelerating back toward the asteroid belt where they had come from. In those 10 minutes, the Valkyrie had destroyed or disabled 23 Horde ships. That was more than the entire Council fleet had managed to destroy in 3 weeks of constant fighting. The Council ships remained in their defensive positions, their crews too shocked to react to what they had just witnessed. Morrison finally reopened communications with the Council flagship. Ambassador Valkyra stared at him through the view screen. all three of her eyes wide with disbelief. She started to ask how they had done it, but Morrison simply told her that Earth's forces had arrived and were ready to assist with the defense of the system. As the Valkyrie returned to the Council fleet, the crew allowed themselves a moment of satisfaction. They had sent a message to the Horde, a message that would echo through the enemy ranks and change the entire nature of the war. Humanity had arrived, and the rules of engagement were about to change completely. The Zorthian Horde learned quickly from their defeat in space. 3 days after the Valkyries' arrival, they changed their strategy completely. Instead of trying to fight the human ship in open space where it dominated, they decided to force a ground battle where their warriors had always excelled. The attack came without warning. A massive Horde carrier ship emerged from behind the system's gas giant, moving at maximum speed toward the inhabited moon. Before the Council fleet could intercept it, the carrier launched thousands of drop pods toward the surface. The pods fell through the atmosphere like a meteor storm, each one containing 50 Zorthian warriors. Ambassador Valkyra contacted Commander Morrison in a panic. Her ground forces were already exhausted from weeks of fighting. The Council soldiers were evolved on worlds with lower gravity than Earth's moon. Moving in the heavier environment tired them quickly, and they couldn't carry as much equipment. Against fresh Zorthian warriors, her troops would be overwhelmed within hours. Morrison listened to her concerns calmly, then told her he would deploy his Marines. Valkyra looked confused. She had assumed the Valkyrie carried only pilots and technicians. When Morrison explained he had 200 combat soldiers aboard, she seemed doubtful that such a small force could make any difference. The Horde had just landed over 50,000 warriors on the moon's surface. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan received her deployment orders in the Marine barracks. Her squad was the first to drop, meaning they would hit the ground before any other human forces. It was an honor, but it also meant they would face the enemy with no backup until the other squads landed. Sullivan gathered her team and ran through final equipment checks. Each Marine carried over 40 kilograms of gear, including weapons, ammunition, armor, and survival equipment. In Earth's gravity, that weight would have been manageable. On the moon, where gravity was lighter, they moved like they were wearing nothing at all. Sergeant Danny White loaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. He had chosen armor-piercing rounds that could punch through steel plating. Next to him, Corporal Amy Brooks checked her grenade launcher, making sure each explosive was properly seated. The other members of the squad performed similar checks, each one focused on their assigned weapons and equipment. The drop pods launched from the Valkyrie like bullets from a gun. Inside her pod, Sullivan felt the crushing acceleration as the small craft accelerated toward the moon's surface. The ride down was rough and loud, the pod's heat shields glowing red as they hit the atmosphere. Through the small window, she could see other pods falling alongside hers, a rain of metal carrying Earth's warriors into battle. The pod hit the ground with bone-jarring force, but the Marine's armor absorbed most of the impact. The hatch blew open and Sullivan was moving before the smoke cleared. Her squad formed up around her in a defensive circle, weapons raised and searching for targets. They had landed on a rocky plateau overlooking the main settlement where the Council forces had established their defensive lines. Below them, Sullivan could see the battle already in progress. Council soldiers were firing at approaching Zorthian warriors from behind hastily built barricades. The defensive fire was steady and precise, but it wasn't stopping the enemy advance. Then Sullivan saw her first Zorthian up close. The creature was massive, standing 3 meters tall on 4 powerful legs. Its body was covered in thick chitinous armor that looked like black metal, and it had 6 arms ending in razor-sharp claws. The head was mostly hidden behind the armor, but she could see multiple eyes glowing red with aggression. A group of 20 Zorthians was climbing the plateau toward their position, having detected the human landing. Sullivan ordered her squad to engage at maximum effective range. The Marines opened fire simultaneously, and the difference between human and Council weapons became immediately apparent. The Council's energy weapons left scorch marks on the Zorthian armor, but rarely penetrated deep enough to cause serious damage. Human kinetic rifles, firing solid slugs at supersonic speeds, punched straight through that armor like it was made of paper. The first volley dropped 7 Zorthians instantly, each one killed by a single shot to center mass. The remaining Zorthians charged, their speed surprising for creatures of their size. They closed the distance from 500 meters to 100 in seconds, but the Marines never stopped firing. Each shot was aimed and controlled, not the panic fire of desperate soldiers, but the measured response of trained professionals. 3 Zorthians reached the Marine position, their claws extended for close combat. This was where the Horde always won against Council soldiers. The Council troops were smaller, weaker, and completely unprepared for melee fighting. But humans had spent their entire evolutionary history as persistence hunters who could fight hand-to-hand when necessary. Sergeant White met the first Zorthian head-on. The creature swung at him with 2 of its clawed arms, strikes that would have cut a Council soldier in half. White ducked under the attack and stepped inside the creature's reach. His combat knife, made of reinforced steel and sharpened to a molecular edge, found the weak point where the Zorthian's armor plates met. The creature died before it understood what had happened. Corporal Brooks took out the second Zorthian with her grenade launcher at point-blank range. The explosion threw both her and the alien backward, but her armor protected her from serious injury. The Zorthian wasn't as lucky. Private Chris Taylor killed the third one with concentrated rifle fire to its head, the only part of its body not covered by the thick armor. The entire fight lasted less than 2 minutes. 20 Zorthian warriors, creatures that had terrorized the Council's finest soldiers, lay dead around the human position. Sullivan's squad had taken no casualties. 1 Marine had a bruised shoulder from his close encounter, and Brooks would probably have some spectacular bruises from her explosion. But everyone could still fight. More drop pods hit the ground around them as the rest of the Marine company deployed. 200 human soldiers spread across the battlefield, taking positions alongside the exhausted Council forces. The Council soldiers watched them with a mixture of hope and confusion. These humans looked slow and bulky in their heavy armor, carrying primitive weapons that fired metal bullets. How could they possibly succeed where the Council had failed? The answer came when the next Horde wave attacked. 300 Zorthian warriors charged the defensive line in a coordinated assault. The Council soldiers opened fire with their energy weapons, scoring hits but failing to stop the advance. Then the human Marines joined the fight. The sound of 200 rifles firing simultaneously was deafening. The concentrated fire tore through the Zorthian front ranks like a chainsaw through wood. Creatures that had seemed unstoppable fell in heaps, their armor providing no protection against the kinetic impacts. Those that survived the initial volley charged faster, trying to close the distance, but they never made it. The Marines fired in controlled bursts, each shot placed with precision. They used the terrain to their advantage, positioning themselves on high ground and behind solid cover. When Zorthians did manage to reach close range, the humans fought them in melee combat without hesitation, using knives, rifle butts, and even their armored fists to brutal effect. In 30 minutes, the Horde's assault broke completely. The survivors retreated in disorder, leaving over 200 bodies behind. The human Marines had stopped an attack that should have overwhelmed the defensive position. They had done it without losing a single soldier. As the battlefield fell quiet, Ambassador Valkyra stood on the settlement's command tower, staring at the carnage below. She had watched the entire battle through remote cameras. She had seen humans fight in a way that no Council species could match, with aggression and violence that should have horrified her, but instead filled her with desperate hope. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this war. 5 days after the first ground battle, Ambassador Valkyra requested a private meeting with Commander Morrison. She arrived at the Valkyrie in a small shuttle, her usual diplomatic escort reduced to a single guard. Morrison met her in the ship's main conference room, which had been designed for exactly these kinds of meetings between humans and aliens. The ambassador looked different than she had during their first communication. The exhaustion was still there, but it was now mixed with confusion and something that might have been fear. She had spent the past 5 days watching humans fight, and what she had seen challenged everything she thought she understood about warfare and civilization. Morrison offered her water, which she accepted gratefully. Council biology was similar enough to human that they could consume many of the same basic substances. After a long moment of silence, she asked the question that had been bothering her since the Valkyrie's arrival. How were the humans so effective in combat? Their weapons were less advanced than Council technology. Their tactics seemed reckless. Yet they were winning battles that had been impossible for the Council fleet. Morrison considered his answer carefully. This conversation would determine how the galaxy viewed humanity for generations to come. He decided that honesty was the best approach. He asked if the ambassador had ever studied Earth's history or environment. When she admitted she had not, beyond the basic classification as a death world, he called for Dr. Laura Bennett. Dr. Bennett was the Valkyrie's chief science officer and an expert in xenobiology. She had spent years studying the differences between Earth life and the species that made up the Galactic Council. She entered the conference room carrying a data pad filled with information she had prepared specifically for this conversation. Bennett began with the basics. She pulled up a holographic image of Earth and compared it to images of typical Council homeworlds. The differences were immediately obvious. Earth's gravity was nearly twice as strong. Its atmospheric pressure was higher. The oxygen concentration in its air was at levels that would be toxic to most Council species if they breathed it for extended periods. Then she showed images of Earth's surface. The ambassador saw vast oceans whipped by storms that could level cities. Deserts where temperatures reached levels that would kill most Council species in minutes. Polar regions covered in ice where temperatures dropped low enough to freeze carbon dioxide solid. Jungles filled with plants and animals competing so fiercely for survival that nearly everything was either poisonous or predatory. Bennett explained that humans had evolved in this environment. Every aspect of their biology had been shaped by the constant need to survive on a world that actively tried to kill them. Their bones were dense and strong to support their weight in high gravity. Their muscles were powerful, allowing them to run for hours without stopping. Their skin could handle temperature variations that would cause other species to go into shock. The human immune system was particularly impressive. It could identify and fight off thousands of different diseases, many of which would be instantly fatal to Council species. Humans could develop immunity to many poisons and toxins through exposure. They could even survive having significant portions of their body damaged or removed, something that would kill most Council citizens immediately. But the physical advantages were only part of the story. Bennett moved on to human psychology and social development. Humans were social creatures who formed strong bonds with their groups. They were capable of extraordinary cooperation when facing common threats. This had allowed them to survive challenges that would have destroyed less social species. More importantly, humans had evolved as persistence hunters. They didn't have the speed of Earth's fastest predators or the strength of its largest animals. Instead, they had endurance and intelligence. They could track prey for days, working together to exhaust animals much larger and stronger than themselves. They could plan complex hunts, create weapons, and adapt their tactics based on what they learned. Ambassador Valkyra listened with growing horror. She had known Earth was classified as a death world, but she had never understood what that really meant. The Council had assumed it meant the planet was dangerous. They had never considered that the danger itself was what made humans so formidable. Morrison took over the explanation. He talked about human history, the thousands of years of warfare between different groups of humans. He explained how conflict had driven technological advancement and tactical innovation. Every weapon humans used had been developed through trial and error, tested in actual combat and refined over generations. The concept of total war, where entire populations devoted themselves to defeating an enemy, was uniquely human. The Council species had never faced existential threats from each other. They had developed space travel and formed their civilization through cooperation and trade. They had weapons, but those weapons were designed for precision and minimal casualties. Human weapons were designed to kill efficiently. Nuclear weapons, kinetic bombardment, biological agents, every tool of destruction had been created because humans understood that sometimes survival meant being more dangerous than whatever threatened them. The Council viewed these weapons as barbaric, but to humans they were simply necessary tools. Morrison explained why human tactics seemed reckless. Council military doctrine emphasized protecting soldiers because each life was precious and difficult to replace. Human history was filled with examples of small forces defeating larger ones through aggressive action and willingness to accept casualties. Humans understood that sometimes the only way to win was to take risks that seemed insane to anyone who hadn't been shaped by millions of years of survival on a death world. The ambassador was quiet for a long time after Morrison finished. She was processing information that challenged her fundamental understanding of what intelligent life could be. The Council had always assumed that advancement meant moving beyond violence and aggression. They believed that any species reaching the stars would naturally develop peaceful, cooperative societies. Humans had reached the stars, but they had brought their violence with them. Not because they were cruel or evil, but because violence was a survival tool that had been useful for so long that it was woven into every aspect of their culture and biology. They were capable of cooperation and compassion, but they were also capable of focused aggression that could overwhelm any enemy. Valkyra finally spoke, asking the question that terrified her most. If humans were this dangerous, what would stop them from becoming a threat to the Council? What would prevent them from using their superior combat abilities to conquer instead of protect? Morrison's answer was simple. Humans understood the difference between survival and conquest. They had learned through painful experience that conquering others created enemies and ultimately made everyone less safe. Modern human society valued cooperation and mutual benefit. They were willing to fight when necessary, but they preferred to build rather than destroy. The proof was in their actions. Earth had sent help when the Council called, even though the Council had kept humanity isolated for centuries. Human Marines were fighting alongside Council soldiers, protecting civilians who belonged to species they had never met before. They could have demanded payment or political concessions, but instead they had simply asked where they were needed. Dr. Bennett added one final observation. Yes, humans were dangerous. Yes, they were shaped by violence and hardship. But those same experiences had taught them the value of cooperation and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. They were warriors, but they were warriors with principles. Ambassador Valkyra left the meeting with much to consider. She had called Earth asking for backup, for a few extra soldiers to help hold a defensive line. What she had received was something far more powerful and far more terrifying. She had received the help of a species that had been forged in fire, and had learned to wield that fire as a weapon. The question now was whether the galaxy was ready to accept such dangerous allies. The ground war continued for 3 more weeks. The Zorthian horde kept sending waves of warriors to the moon's surface, and each time the combined human and council forces pushed them back. The pattern became predictable. The horde would attack with overwhelming numbers, the council forces would provide supporting fire, and the human Marines would hold the critical positions where the fighting was fiercest. But Commander Morrison knew this couldn't continue forever. The Marines were holding their own, but they were only 200 soldiers facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reinforcements. Eventually, exhaustion would take its toll, or the horde would find a weakness in their defenses. The only way to truly win was to take the fight to the enemy's command structure. Intelligence reports from Council scouts had identified the horde's command ship, a massive vessel that served as both flagship and mobile headquarters. It was larger than any other ship in the horde fleet, a bioorganic construct that pulsed with sickly light. Every attack was coordinated from that ship, and every tactical decision flowed from its command center. Morrison proposed a plan that made the Council admirals think he had lost his mind. He wanted to take the Valkyrie and attack the command ship directly, not from long range with missiles and energy weapons, but up close where the Valkyrie's weapons would have maximum effect. It was suicide by any reasonable calculation. The command ship was protected by hundreds of support vessels and multiple layers of shields that had resisted every weapon the Council possessed. Ambassador Valkyra tried to talk him out of it during an emergency meeting with the Council's military leaders. She pointed out that losing the Valkyrie would mean losing humanity's only ship in the system. Without the human warship, the combined fleet would be forced back to pure defensive operations, and they would eventually be overwhelmed. Morrison listened politely, then explained his reasoning. The Horde's command ship was the key to their entire strategy. Without it, the enemy forces would lose coordination. Their attacks would become disorganized. More importantly, the Horde's doctrine relied on overwhelming aggression. They had never faced an enemy willing to match that aggression and raise it to a level they couldn't counter. Lieutenant Commander Alex Turner had been working on a solution to the shield problem. The Council's energy weapons tried to penetrate the shields gradually, applying constant pressure until they broke through. This approach worked on smaller ships but failed against the command ship's massive generators. Turner proposed a different approach based on simple physics. Instead of trying to penetrate the shields, they would overload them. The Valkyrie would deliver every nuclear warhead in its arsenal simultaneously at point-blank range. The combined energy release would be massive, far more than the shields were designed to handle. The shields wouldn't fail gradually. They would collapse all at once, leaving the command ship vulnerable for a brief moment. The Council admirals immediately pointed out the fatal flaw in this plan. Delivering the warheads at close range meant the Valkyrie would be inside the blast radius when they detonated. The ship would be destroyed along with its target. Morrison acknowledged this was true under normal circumstances, but the Valkyrie had one advantage that Council ships lacked. Human faster-than-light technology was different from the Council's Council. Ships needed to be outside a gravity well to engage their FTL drives safely. Human ships, built with the understanding that war rarely happened in convenient locations, could jump from much deeper in a gravity field. It would be dangerous and would likely cause serious damage to the ship, but it was survivable. Morrison's plan was simple. The Valkyrie would accelerate toward the command ship at maximum speed. At the last possible moment, they would release their entire nuclear payload and immediately execute an emergency FTL jump. The warheads would detonate, overloading the shields. The Council fleet would be in position to fire on the exposed command ship during the brief window, before the shields regenerated. The Council admirals reluctantly agreed. They didn't have better options, and Morrison's track record suggested his crazy plan somehow worked. The attack was scheduled for the next day, giving both fleets time to prepare. On the Valkyrie, the crew worked through the night preparing the ship. Engineers reinforced the FTL drive systems and calculated the exact parameters needed for the emergency jump. Weapons officers programmed the nuclear warheads for simultaneous detonation. Lieutenant Sam Carter ran simulations of the attack run, practicing the flight path until she could fly it blindfolded. Captain Ryan Blake gathered the crew in the main hangar bay that evening. He explained the mission and didn't sugarcoat the risks. There was a good chance the ship wouldn't survive the FTL jump. The stress on the hull and drive systems would be immense, and they were pushing the technology far beyond its tested limits. Anyone who wanted to transfer to a Council ship would be allowed to do so without any judgment. Not a single crew member volunteered to leave. They had trained for situations exactly like this, impossible missions where success required taking calculated risks that looked like suicide to anyone else. They were human. And humans had been doing the impossible since their ancestors first looked at the stars and decided to reach them. The attack began at dawn, calculated by the moon's rotation, even though the concept of dawn was purely symbolic in space. The Council fleet moved into position, forming a firing line that would have clear shots at the command ship once its shields dropped. The Horde noticed the unusual formation but didn't understand its significance. They had seen the Council try different tactics before, and none had succeeded. The Valkyrie broke from the Council formation and accelerated toward the Horde's rear position where the command ship lurked. On the bridge, Morrison watched the distance counter tick down. 10,000 kilometers, 5,000, 3,000. The Horde fleet tried to intercept, but the Valkyrie's speed and maneuverability allowed Carter to weave between them. At 1,000 kilometers, the Horde finally understood what was happening. The command ship tried to retreat, but it was too large and slow to evade. Its support ships moved to block the Valkyrie, but Turner destroyed them with quick bursts from the railguns. Nothing was going to stop them now. At 500 kilometers, Morrison gave the order. Turner released every nuclear warhead simultaneously. 47 weapons, each containing enough explosive power to level a city, streaked toward the command ship. The Horde's point defense systems engaged, destroying nearly a third of them, but the rest continued on their trajectory. Carter didn't wait to see the impact. The moment the weapons were released, she executed the emergency FTL jump. The Valkyrie's faster-than-light drive engaged while still deep in the system's gravity well, doing something that Council scientists insisted was impossible. Space twisted around the ship in ways that made the crew's eyes hurt to look at. Then reality snapped back and they were on the far side of the moon, their hull groaning from the stress but intact. Behind them, the nuclear warheads reached the command ship and detonated as one. The combined explosion released energy equivalent to several gigatons of TNT in a single instant. The command ship's shields absorbed most of the blast, but the sheer power was too much for the generators to handle. The shields flickered, failed, and went offline. For exactly 4 seconds, the command ship was vulnerable. The Council fleet, following Morrison's carefully coordinated plan, fired everything they had at the exposed target. Hundreds of energy beams converged on the massive vessel. The bioorganic hull designed to regenerate from damage couldn't heal fast enough. Entire sections vaporized under the sustained bombardment. The command ship's reactor went critical, adding its own explosion to the destruction. When the light faded, the massive vessel was gone. In its place was an expanding cloud of debris and superheated gas. Without their command ship, the remaining Horde vessels fell into chaos. Some tried to flee. Others fought on until they were destroyed. Within hours, the battle was over. The Proxima system was secure. On the Valkyrie's damaged bridge, Commander Morrison allowed himself a small smile. They had done it. Against impossible odds, with a single ship and 200 Marines, humanity had helped save an entire star system. The galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. The week after the battle was spent cleaning up and recovering. The Council fleet worked to clear debris from orbital space around the moon. Medical teams treated the wounded, both Council and human. Engineers assessed damage to ships and stations. It was the quiet work that always followed war. Less dramatic than the fighting, but just as necessary. The Valkyrie had survived its emergency FTL jump, but just barely. The ship's hull had stress fractures in a dozen places. 2 of the main engines were offline. The faster-than-light drive would need to be completely rebuilt before the ship could make another jump. Captain Ryan Blake estimated repairs would take at least 2 months, even with help from Council engineers. On the moon's surface, Lieutenant Kate Sullivan walked through the settlement where they had fought so many battles. The streets were being rebuilt by Council workers and their machines. Children played in areas that had been battlefields days before. It was strange to see normal life returning so quickly after such violence. A group of Council civilians approached her, their leader a tall being with 4 arms and skin that changed color based on emotion. Through a translation device, the civilian thanked Sullivan and her Marines for protecting them. The civilian's skin shifted to a warm gold color, which Sullivan's briefing materials had taught her meant gratitude and respect. Sullivan accepted the thanks awkwardly. She had been a soldier for 6 years and had fought in several conflicts back on Earth. People had thanked her before, but this felt different. These weren't her people. They weren't even her species. Yet she had fought to protect them, and they had accepted that protection. It made her think about what humanity's role in the galaxy might become. Sergeant Danny White found her a few minutes later. He reported that the Marine Company had taken final casualties count. 3 dead, 17 wounded badly enough to need extended medical care, and 42 with minor injuries. Against an enemy that had killed thousands of Council soldiers, those numbers were remarkable. Sullivan thought about the 3 who hadn't made it home. Private Nick Davis had been killed in the 2nd week when a Zorthian acid spitter had breached his armor. Corporal Lisa Morgan had died holding a choke point against 50 Horde warriors, buying time for civilians to evacuate. Lance Corporal Chris Taylor had taken a direct hit from a Horde energy weapon during the final battle. All 3 had died doing their duty, protecting people they had never met before. The Council held a memorial service for all the fallen, both their own soldiers and the human Marines. It was held in the settlement's main square, which had been hastily cleared of battle damage. Thousands of Council civilians attended, along with soldiers from both fleets. Ambassador Valkyra gave a speech about sacrifice and courage. Her words translated into dozens of languages. Commander Morrison spoke on behalf of the human forces. He kept his words simple, saying that the Marines had done what humans had always done when faced with impossible odds. They had refused to give up. They had adapted to challenges, and they had protected those who needed protection. The 3 who died had exemplified the best of what humanity could be. After the memorial, Ambassador Valkyra invited Morrison to a private meeting in her quarters aboard the Council flagship. The room was decorated in a style that Morrison found both alien and beautiful, with flowing curves and colors that seemed to shift in the light. The ambassador offered him a beverage that her people considered a sign of respect and friendship. She began by formally thanking him for Earth's assistance. The Council had been hours away from complete defeat when the Valkyrie arrived. Without human intervention, the Proxima system would have fallen, and the Horde would have had a clear path to the Council's core worlds where tens of billions of civilians lived. Then she moved to the real reason for the meeting. The Council wanted to establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth. For 2 centuries, they had kept humanity at a distance, treating Earth as a quarantine zone that should be monitored but never contacted. That policy had been based on fear and misunderstanding. The past weeks had proven that while humans were dangerous, they were also honorable and could be trusted as allies. The Council was prepared to offer Earth full membership, including access to their technology, trade networks, and scientific knowledge. In exchange, they hoped Earth would consider joining their mutual defense pact. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the Zorthian horde was just one of many threats. Having humans as allies would make everyone safer. Morrison listened carefully. This was beyond his authority to accept or reject. These decisions would be made by Earth's government after long deliberations. But he could offer his personal opinion. He told Valkyra that humanity had always wanted to be part of the larger galactic community. They understood they had much to learn from species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years, but Morrison also made it clear that Earth would not change who they were to fit into the Council's expectations. Humans were shaped by their evolution on a harsh world. They were warriors when they needed to be, but they were also explorers, scientists, artists, and dreamers. They would bring all of those qualities to any partnership, both the comfortable ones and the uncomfortable ones. The ambassador accepted this with grace. She admitted that the Council had been too focused on their own way of doing things. They had assumed that advanced civilization meant abandoning aggression and violence completely. Humans had shown them that violence could be a tool used responsibly, that warriors could also be protectors, and that sometimes the greatest mercy was having the strength to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. 3 days later, the Valkyrie prepared to leave orbit. The ship couldn't make the journey back to Earth under its own power, so a Council vessel would tow them to the nearest major shipyard where proper repairs could be done. From there, they would eventually make their way home. The Marine Company assembled in the ship's main hangar bay for a final formation. Lieutenant Sullivan looked at her soldiers and felt pride mixed with sadness. They had come to the Proxima system as an unknown quantity, representatives of a species the galaxy feared and misunderstood. They were leaving as heroes, having proven that humanity deserved a place among the stars. As the Valkyrie began its journey home, Morrison stood on the bridge watching the Proxima system shrink behind them. He thought about everything that had happened since that first distress call arrived at Earth Defense Command. The galaxy had called for backup, expecting a few extra soldiers to help hold a defensive line. Instead, they had gotten something far more powerful. They had gotten humans. Warriors from a death world who had learned to thrive in impossible conditions. Soldiers who understood that sometimes survival required violence, but who also understood that violence without purpose was just destruction. People who could fight with absolute ferocity one moment and show compassion the next, because both were necessary parts of being human. Morrison received a message from Admiral Lisa Morgan back on Earth. She had been briefed on everything that happened and had already begun, coordinating with the Council's diplomatic corps. Earth's government was moving forward with formal relations, and the military was preparing to establish a permanent presence in Council space. But more importantly, the Admiral told him that word of the Proxima victory was spreading through the galaxy. Other Council worlds that had been threatened by various enemies were now asking if human forces could be deployed to help protect them. The Council was learning that sometimes the best defense was having allies who refused to accept defeat as an option. Morrison smiled at that. Humanity had spent centuries wondering if they were alone in the universe. Then they had discovered the Galactic Council, and wondered if they would ever be accepted by the civilizations that had been exploring space for thousands of years. Now the answer was clear. Not only would humanity be accepted, they would be valued. The galaxy had learned that when desperate situations arose, when all other options had failed, there was one species that could be counted on to arrive with determination, courage, and enough firepower to get the job done. The aliens had called for backup, but what they got were Earth's Deathworlders, and the galaxy would never be the same again.